We're here today again with Dr. Holly Geyer, an addiction specialist, and we thank you so much for being here with us today. So we're going to be talking a little bit about where do I turn for help? And I know as a parent, having had to deal with this, it was a difficult, situation to learn about it, but then it was even more difficult trying to navigate what do I do? And I know you spent some time on this, and you even wrote a book called Ending the Crisis about this issue. But I think that started because of some personal background that you had, and maybe it even was the impetus for you to kind of go down this road and get more engaged in this topic. So maybe we could just start off a little bit with that.
Yeah, Kim, you nailed it. It's hard to talk to anyone these days who doesn't have some degree of personal experience on this topic. A new study just came out. It showed 50% of Americans have a close loved one who's actively struggling with addiction. I'm part of that statistic. I had a very close family member who was impacted by this whole process, and it was painful to watch. My personal story, and one of the big reasons I wrote the book is because I think there's opportunities for family members to address addiction in their loved ones and do it well. My personal story, I had a close loved one who unfortunately had a relative, a first-degree relative, who had struggled with addiction through most of their childhood, or at least through their teenage years, and the family became very concerned that that person's impact on the rest of the family would compromise the other children's ability to function, or ultimately even risked the development of drug addiction in them. And so they ostracized that person. Communication was minimal. The kids couldn't speak with this other person, and it really changed family dynamics. I think probably the most challenging part of that story, though, is as the family grew up and they all turned into adults, this person who struggled with addiction became clean. They started to get their life back. They were involved with activities. And despite that, the family members around them continued to hold them at arm's length, almost no communication, because of the concern that they would be at risk for relapse should they ever engage in communication again. And that's not how addiction works. That's not how recovery works. And there's so many opportunities to do this better. So I hope maybe from my personal experience and from what we know in the literature and what's worked for other families, that we can impart some of that knowledge today.
So let me start by asking about what the average family member feels when they are facing addiction in a loved one.
Lonely, frightening. There's a lot of words we could use for this. And for everyone involved, especially if it's happening to someone who filled critical roles in the family. I'm talking fathers or mothers or homemakers or the breadwinner. You can imagine how the whole family unit can dismantle. And as the condition of addiction advances, it's going to start to affect other people. As that person faces unemployment or disability, they're going to create other financial instabilities, and that's going to put further burdens on other people. And then we've got these negative emotional states that we talked about in one of our other discussions. And these negative emotion states can diffuse through the whole household. What might have previously been an environment of trust and peace, that can quickly erode into distrust and emotional outbursts and instability and fear and anxiety. With all these negative emotions, you're going to see changes in communication patterns. This is probably one of the most destructive parts of addiction. The emotions that stem from all the mistrust and loneliness and anger and neglect on the person or family members experiencing the side effects of addiction is going to oftentimes turn into resentment and then blame, and this cycle perpetuates. In the end, communication can be pretty less frequent, minimally productive if it does happen, and oftentimes non-existent.
Well, certainly I can say that I can relate. And when my wife and I learned this about our sons, first and foremost, I would just want to agree. We felt alone, and we just did not know where to turn. We did not know what to do, and we became more and more isolated as we realized that, we just didn't know who we could talk to about this. And it became much more difficult for us as time continued on because, well, frankly, a lot of people just didn't know how to respond to us. And so that leads me to, asking you, what do you think the most important thing you think families need to know about addiction?
Rule number one, if our families listening are feeling any of this, you are not alone. You are the norm. This pattern is expected in many situations, and it gets worse over the advancement of the addiction and the life cycle of it. I would say if you find yourself in this position today, we're going to talk about the key steps that you can do to take your life back, to gain control and get the support that you need, and to offer that support to the loved ones experiencing addiction in love. In this section, I really want to focus more so on the severe states of addiction when families are most impacted. Early states of addiction may not mean or require the degree of intervention we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, but it's good to keep in mind if situations devolve.
Great. Well, I think, one of the greatest emotions family members feel is fear. When it really comes down to it, it's that fear of losing your loved one, fear about an overdose, your family is pulled apart, your finances are being, strained, your reputation, and how you feel around others is impacted significantly. And there's many, many other issues. And it's a very scary problem for a family to deal with. And is there anything you can say to families to help with that fear? Because that is overwhelming.
Yes, the odds of success are with you. I'm going to say it again. The odds of success are with you. Recovery for most people struggling with addiction is the norm, not the exception. The literature has hinted at this for years, but we had a great study that was done in 2018. It looked at 43,000 people endorsing a history of substance use. And they found that despite, nearly 1 out of every 10 Americans having struggled with a disorder, more than 75% of those people were in active recovery. So it's key, Kim, to understand. Those that receive treatment are going to have a better outcome, are going to have a greater odd of achieving that outcome. But many of those who don't even make it to a point of achieving a state of going into a program or engaging in regular activities will still at some point reach sobriety and then go on to lead a very fulfilling life. So the key takeaway, I would say, is that there is a very likely end date to the drama and all the pain. The key is you as a family member helping them bridge that person to the date.
Well, that's encouraging because, most people believe otherwise, and I think it's for the obvious reasons that we continue to hear about the loss of life and we continue to hear about how many times individuals relapse. But the odds are actually more for you if you can stick with this for the long haul and realize that it may not be something that's quick and it may not be something that happens overnight, but it's certainly something that as an individual like my wife and I, who felt like we were losing control of our life, and I think you sort of alluded to that fact that, you may feel like that. And we were trying to deal with this, but we felt like our life was just unraveling. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, you've nailed it, Kim. Addiction affects all domains of existence. The lives of loved ones with addiction are so closely intertwined with our own. What affects them is going to affect us. And so this means that when someone with a substance use disorder starts to spiral out of control, they're going to take us with them. The first step to addressing addiction is taking back control of the parts of your life that you can control. The most important part of what you can and should control is your personal safety and that of any of your dependents. I'm talking kids. Is your loved one drinking and driving? Are they bringing drugs into the house? Is their drug use associated with any of the criminal activities, or are they using weapons? These are all key to think about.
So when you talk about trying to deal with that in particular, especially issues with safety, maybe we should talk about that, ending that, behavior or doing something as the person that needs to set some boundaries here. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, Kim, if any of these things that impact your safety or your loved one's safety is going on, I would say the first step number one, is to end that behavior today, not tomorrow, today. There are deaths across America because drugs make it into the wrong hands or unsavory personalities enter the household. You need to be proactive. You have the right and the responsibility as a family member to set limits to any activities that are going to compromise safety. And these can be activities that impact both the emotional and physical health of you or your family. So one of the best things that you can do is set those boundaries and set them early.
So let's talk about boundaries. That's to me, I always like to break it down to, what's okay and what's not okay, and maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and what it looks like from your perspective.
Yeah, setting boundaries, it might involve firmly declaring what you can and cannot let happen in the household. And then, of course, documenting and making sure they're aware of any associated consequences, like police involvement if that person's not adhering to your requirements, all the way to either evacuating the environment yourself or forcing that person using the drugs to find alternative housing. Don't feel guilty. Some have found it very helpful to draft a list of safety mandates that must be adhered to, and to having that person using substances sign it and then hang it somewhere very obvious for easy recognition. Remember, a lot of addiction is that pursuit of short-term gain at the expense of long-term consequences. Don't let you or those you love be victim to those consequences, Kim.
Well, and I want to be clear, we're talking about these issues of safety. And, we don't jump to the issue of, somebody has to leave a home immediately just because we've discovered an issue here. Mm. But like you have just said, I have had individuals talk to me and they were being physically abused. Some of them were being held against their will, choked, guns pulled on them, things like that. And they were afraid of saying, no, you can't live in my house. And really what we're talking about here is when it's like this and there's a safety issue, those type of boundaries are critical.
Kim, drugs have already claimed one victim in that scenario you just laid out. Don't let it claim two or more.
So what are the next steps after that?
Well, once your safety is intact, the next step is really going to be taking a close look at the roles you fill and the roles they used to fill, and then identify what's left unattended, what's on the to-do list. I would say in less severe forms of addiction, this is probably not an issue in most cases. But in more severe forms, family members are going to find themselves picking up the pieces of loved ones that can't fulfill their roles anymore, and this is going to be tough. Start out by identifying what immediate needs need to be addressed, and then seek assistance or step in to support them. Assuming the roles that the person using drugs can no longer complete can be a huge burden to family members. I get that. And living or picking up the pieces, I should say, could involve, either getting a job yourself to help manage family expenses. Some people have had to transport kids before and after school or to activities. It might involve taking over household responsibilities like the cooking and the cleaning, or meeting healthcare needs of the family members. There is a plethora of things that could be dropped, and don't let those things compile and play catch up when they start getting out of control. Be proactive.
So again, this is really looking at that individual, what their role was, and then trying to make sure that you don't have a gap there, and doing the things to get those things taken care of. So, if it's a son or a daughter and they're younger, they may not have a lot of these types of roles and responsibilities. But then again, if it's a spouse or if it's someone else, it may very well be some things that have to be taken care of.
You nailed it.
So, there's a lot that's getting put on our plates. So, do you have any advice on how to do all this well?
Imagine adding all of these new responsibilities to all of the emotional strains of broken down or actively breaking relationships, and then the added attempts to navigate the substance use treatment field. For many people, it can be overwhelming. I'd have just a few items I would say to make this step easier. Don't be shy. Ask for help and ask early. And then look for community resources. There's family support networks. PAL, AA, NA can be tremendous supports. Look for your churches. Remember that addiction is recognized as a medical condition. So with that, you might be eligible, or your family member might be eligible for short-term disability services. Check into FMLA. Cut back on any unnecessary time commitments and put your focus back on addiction as the top priority. And then take it one day at a time. Remember, relapse and recovery, like we've talked about in other sections, may be your destination, but addiction is a long journey, and it could take a while to get to those destinations. And then one of my top pet peeves is people that go through all of this and don't take time for self-care. If you're a loved one addressing all of these needs, you need time for you. And we've got some recommendations on that, I think, coming up as well.
Well, and I think it's important to put that in context, because if it gets to the point where it's just overwhelming, then sometimes you have to let go of trying to deal with this with them, and you really have to turn the focus on yourself. And honestly, who can you control? Yourself. And so if it ends up being overwhelming, I'm sure what we're getting at here is that at some point you may just have to say, you know what, I can't deal with that for now. And maybe you get the support around you, you get the help you need, and then you might be able to come back into the situation and help out.
Kim, we're Americans, right? Most of us listeners are going to be Americans, and our lives are cluttered. That's our state of existence. Declutter life, and declutter it quickly so that you can make the priorities you need to in the right order.
So getting control, and I say that loosely, of our lives, our own particular lives, it can be challenging, but it can be doable.
Yeah.
So if I can get control back of my own life, where I can start to function in a more appropriate ways, and I guess the next question is what do I do now that I've taken care of myself, and I'm doing the things I need to stay emotionally and even physically well through all of this. What do I do now to address the addiction in my loved one?
Great question. Once we've handled that safety aspect, once the dependents are in a good position and all the immediate needs necessary to have that functioning lifestyle been addressed, I would say then it's time to turn your attention to your loved one dealing with addiction. Think of the order of these steps like instructions you hear on an airline, right? If you want to survive a sudden change in cabin pressure, put on your own air mask first and then assist your others. That's what we're talking about today. To do this, you might want to make sure that you've got the right knowledge and the right tools and the right support systems in place. So when we think about the right knowledge, this involves gaining a good understanding of the person with features of addiction, what they're likely using, how it's impacting their lifestyle. Again, go back to the ABCDEs that we talked about in one of the other sections. Think of their readiness to change, right? Is this something that they're admitting to? Or are they hiding it still? It also means educating yourself on the causes of addiction, the biology that tends to drive it, all of the mental illnesses that can be contributors, and then ultimately the role that you play in treatment. When I talk about the right tools, this means, essentially the homework on your part to investigate what treatment programs your insurance company is going to cover, what level of care that person might need, and what type of program structures are engaged. If you're a family that has a strong faith value, you're going to want to look in programs that offer that. And then, of course, there's the right support system. This means actively engaging the support from those most likely to help you and the person with addiction. These can be close friends, they can be family, they can be trusted spiritual, religious staff members, your family doctor, do not forget them, and then drug and alcohol specialists or others.
Yeah, and as we've talked about in other sections, we've gotten into some of the issues where, there's only so much you can do, and sometimes we spend a lot of time doing all of this only to be frustrated by the fact that they're not interested, they're not willing, they're not ready, for any other way to say it. And so, once again, putting this in context, we're dealing with somebody that maybe this is the first time we've been around this issue. We're trying to do the best we can. We do all of our homework, and then we try and set them up for success. And then we have to kind of go from there. So I assume that makes sense, right? I mean, at some point,
Absolutely.
You can't keep doing things until they're ready to do them.
Kim, you're talking about boundaries, and you're absolutely right. It's important to understand that not everyone that you're starting to see evidence of addiction with is going to be ready to change or even willing to acknowledge that they have a developing disorder. Family members can run themselves ragged, attempting to address this over and over, attempting to drive insight into that person when they're simply not ready to accept it. And I would say there's got to be a degree of subtlety on your part to recognize there's going to be a place and a time when that person will likely be ready. If it's not today, don't kill yourself and them in attempts to make this conversation happen. Make time for it, but don't make it your life.
So let's talk about when and how to address addiction in a loved one. Is there a special way to do it?
Definitely. This is key to understand for our entire audience. Despite all you may have experienced or gone through, remember this. That person you love is not the disease. They have a disease. I'm going to say it again. That person you love is not the disease. They have a disease. And once you separate the person from the disorder, it makes it so much easier to address them both independently. If you think about it, that person is someone you care for and you continue to fight for, and you'll make every effort to preserve. It's that person deep inside that you've known for years, and they're trapped in a mind that won't let them out, and they're imprisoned in a body that can't function without the drug. The person you love doesn't want to be in this state. The disease is that biochemical and neuroadaptive prison that they're trapped in. It's something that you'll be putting boundaries around. It's something you're going to monitor and work towards treating. It's what will drive their responses to you while they continue to be under its grip. Knowing that there's a person and a disease, I think, is an important distinction and allows you to take the important steps of keeping the relationship going. It can help you when times get rocky or comments are harsh to keep focused on the end results. With all family members that may have gone through this at times, nothing could be easier than removing yourself from the relationship. But remember, your relationship might be the only access point that person has to getting the help they need.
And so as long as you can try and keep that door open, and assuming that it hasn't gotten to the point of its, like we've talked about before, where there's safety or issues where it's out of control, having an open relationship doesn't necessarily mean doing things or giving them things or those types of things. It simply means maintaining that relationship to where you can still be a positive influence in their life.
Bingo. You're nailing it, Kim. When I think back to that personal story that impacted my family, that the understanding on the part of the individuals that kept that loved one at arm's bay was misinformed. It was an assumption that any relationship would be a destructive relationship. And what they negated in that process was the possibility that having safe boundaries could preserve the relationship and still allow there to be one. I would say the data shows that family members play an integral, a critical role in navigating those that need treatments. In fact, oftentimes they might be the only access point to treatment. I would say that the caveat to the concept of staying in touch is making sure that you and your immediate loved ones close to that person are staying safe, both physically and emotionally. If you're noticing that every encounter is confrontational, or if that person is demeaning, or if they're making horrible comments that make you feel unwell, put a distance between you and their threats. Find another way to communicate. This might be, strictly through a counselor's office. And remember, a broken tool is rarely employed to fix another broken item. Their addiction shouldn't create more problems or have another victim besides them. And if their activities are compromising the safety of the home or the household, absolutely do what you need to do to distance yourself from unsafe behavior. We've talked about it, but have them leave the house if they need to. The point is to do it in a manner that sets clear boundaries, but still lets the person using drugs know that the doors are open for communication when and if it can be done safely and respectfully.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our listeners are honestly frustrated and maybe even done with the relationship. That it just seems like it's taking, so much more than they give. And living with someone struggling with addiction, it can be extraordinarily challenging, and trying to let go of control of that relationship can be an easy answer. At some point, do you feel like you you have something that you could recommend when it gets down to that?
I think the concept of control is a general misunderstanding in society. Oftentimes we think of control as something that we exert over another person, when in reality, control is truly a circle around ourselves. We can control what's in our environment, and if and when somebody else is infringing on that circle, that's when our ability to exercise control really begins. And so this concept of forcing another person into a situation where they may not be interested in discussing problems or addressing them is really not realistic and will probably harm the relationship. The only time you can really breach that from a clinical standpoint is if you yourself or your loved ones are in an unsafe position. So finding that delicate balance isn't easy, but needs to be done.
So let's talk about the key steps to, approaching a loved one about your concerns with addiction. I remember trying to deal with this, and at first it was really difficult because, well, first of all, our son was underage. He was 15 years old, and of course he was in a very strong state of denial and not wanting to talk about it. But, what do you recommend? We need to approach them. We want to talk to them. So, some thoughts, some tricks, tips. How do we do that?
Great question. I would go back to those 3 key tricks that we wanted to keep in our back pocket. We talked about a few minutes ago, having the right knowledge, the right tools, and then the right support system. This is where we're going to need to pull those out. When we address addiction in a loved one, remember, this is going to be a process. There are a million reasons that person likely won't want to hear your concerns or the evidence, and first try attempts to address these issues are oftentimes very unsuccessful. Come prepared anyway. Subtle comments about your concerns that come from a perspective of care and compassion can do amazing wonders. Insert them into opportune moments when the person is in a calm or controlled mood. Ask open-ended questions. Look for the degree of insight into even having a problem. And if that person demonstrates an understanding of having a problem, take it. Offer support, offer assistance immediately. You will be so glad that you did your homework and have potential tools or resources or treatment programs in that back pocket. The support network that you've built can help play a similar role, as well as offer you that emotional and social and spiritual support you're going to need to stay committed to the cause, especially if that person's in denial. Remember, this is going to take time. It's going to probably be over multiple discussions, weeks, months, sometimes years. And as the consequences build up, you might see their level of insight grow, their willingness to change evolve. Again, you're waiting for that date until they're gaining insight and they commit to treatment, or they've slowly evolved out of the addiction process and are in a state of recovery. This happens in 75% of cases. In some situations, you might need to take a more formal approach, and these can be tough. This might need to be addressing addiction in a situation called an intervention. These present kind of semi-formal meetings. They're often resolved for situations where a person simply refuses to address the topic or becomes overtly hostile when it's brought up, or if they're facing immediate life-threatening consequences from their drug use patterns. There's a variety of ways to do it, and it can be done well.
So I think we'll address the specifics of how to do an intervention in another segment. And just to recap kind of what we've talked about here today, we're really gotten into this issue of, trying to help understand, what do I do? I'm a parent, I'm a family member, I have, someone that's dealing with this, and, who do I turn to for help? And I guess if you or any last minute thoughts about it, because I can say that when I was dealing with this, this was extraordinary for us, because honestly, we didn't know who to turn to.
Addiction has such a stigma, and that stigma not only travels with the person struggling with addiction, but their loved ones, right? Who would want to come out publicly and said, my son, my daughter, who I raised to be just like me, is now living homeless on the streets, shooting up fentanyl. I would say that hiding can oftentimes be one of the easiest responses as a family member to a state of addiction in a loved one, and probably one of the most harmful, because you will deteriorate as quickly as that person who's injecting the drug. Be open, be willing to discuss this with friends and family and loved ones. Your story is powerful, and it could change the life of somebody else who's going through it as well. So community is going to be key. Don't be afraid to seek it out.
Okay, so what would you say to the family members that are working to help a loved one struggling with addiction who seems disinterested in helping themselves?
I run with the mantra, you can lead a horse to water, but really only the federal or state government can make them drink. At least that's what the data shows. There have been studies that show that individuals that are court-ordered into treatment seem to have outcomes very similar to those who choose addiction treatments willingly, meaning, yes, mom, dad, I want to go to a treatment program. But I'd say that's a bit of an exception, right? In general, people who are disinterested in change are not likely to integrate the techniques in life to really make it happen. As a family member, it can feel like the best chance of recovery of your loved one has is for you to manage their life until they come to that decision to enter treatment. I promise you, Kim, that thinking will consume you, your family, your sanity, and more than likely any other relationship you're in. And equally importantly, it's likely to impair that person who needs treatment from actually getting it. The reality is that in every relationship, we need to define boundaries early. What is the line someone can't cross in my life? And with my time, with my money, with my emotions, having this having these available is going to keep you healthy, even in an unhealthy relationship.
And another term that we hear a lot is this issue of codependency. And I know, it has a lot of different connotations, and many people look at it different ways today. But I still think people can understand this a little better if they understand what that means or what the concept behind it is. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I'm going to rely on my psychologist colleagues for this answer. They've defined codependency as a term to define a relationship in which, by being caring, by being highly functional and very helpful, one is said to support, perpetuate, and ultimately enable a loved one's irresponsible or destructive behavior. So what's this going to look like? Essentially being incapable of setting boundaries in a relationship, or not holding that person using drugs responsible to their behaviors, and maybe taking over responsibilities and not letting them handle their own problems. Giving into the demands of problems, or giving into the demands of someone using drugs in order to preserve the relationship, and oftentimes just developing low self-esteem in the process. I would say codependency is a very easy path to enabling. Enabling means contributing to the relationship in a way that promotes ongoing unhealthy behaviors. Taking away the non-fatal negative consequences from a person making bad decisions definitely makes the cut. I would say some examples. Continuing to finance someone with addiction who has no income and refuses to go to treatment. How about allowing someone with addiction to deal drugs out of the house, or have a negative influencers continue to come to your house? Our listeners have the right and the responsibility to draw those lines, Kim, and then hold their loved ones struggling with substance use to them.
So I can say that was one of the most difficult things for us to understand. And, my wife and I would say that the most important thing that we started to learn was the fact that we do not want to contribute to this. We do not want to make it worse. We want to do whatever we can to help them in a healthy way. And that was the key, is we didn't start talking about right and wrong. We started talking about healthy versus unhealthy things that we can do. Yeah. And I think that goes back to your idea of doing your homework so that you can know what are the healthy things I can do to help my loved one.
Absolutely. We've talked about doing our homework to help that loved one find a treatment option. And this is a gracious act of really giving them a tool to help them escape their addiction, but it is up to them to use it. Intervene with your concerns, bring up the tools you found, set your boundaries, but let them make the choice. Bailing them out of bad ones will only teach them that their decisions aren't paired with consequences.
And I think that's a hard thing to understand because we just always think of consequences and we go down the road of
Yeah.
the worst case scenario. And yet, it goes back to what we've talked about before. You can't control
Yeah.
another person.
Yeah.
And so taking on the idea that you're in control of whatever the outcome is sort of falls into that same thing.
And Kim, my heart goes out to parents. You know, for upwards of 18 years of a person's life, they were in a situation where they were that person bailing this person out of problems, right? They were staging the intervention for other problems to fix their life. And once someone's an adult, right, even, you know, in their teenage years, there's some degree of autonomy, and we need to respect that. There's ways to deal with it, and we want to prepare our audience for that.